So really the aim of the presentation today, even if you are experienced with the Adult Learner Journal that AONTAS publishes, is to talk about the ethos of the journal, the particular calls that have happened over the years and the particular 2025 call that we're talking about today. And just to give you a whistle-stop tour of what that means and what our expectations are around that and the criteria for submission of articles. So hopefully this presentation will work as a form of notes for you as well, which will give you the detail, and we'll embed the links into it to the extensive documentation. And by extensive, I mean just very clear, straightforward documentation that AONTAS provides on their website for you already. So we'll tip into those as well as we go. So just over the next little while, we'll look at the journal, the ethos, the requirements for the journal, some examples from past submissions that have been published, and the next steps for yourselves then in terms of moving forward. So this workshop is one of two. So this first one is by its nature broad to talk about the things I've just mentioned. And the second workshop will take place on the 13th of January. And that's really to get into more detail really about the writing style, the writing kind of criteria, and to help and advise you in your writing as you go about that for the submission date of articles on the 14th of February in 2025. So that's really what we'll be working for on the 13th, but this is by its nature broad. So I'm kind of going right back to the beginning here around the origins of the adult learner, which was back in the 70s. And that's one of the first covers there that you can see, very, very expressive and very relevant today still around adult learners. And really, it was founded in the mid-70s, from mid-80s, from discussions in the 70s moving forwards. And at the time, adult and community education was quite fragmented and moving together slowly through the influence of many factors, including the ESF and European funds and other ways through the further adult and education sector. This document really documents the growth and development of adult learning policy and practice, and it talks about providing a forum for critical reflection on teaching and learning around disadvantage, around social exclusion, equality, and social justice, which are really key themes to the adult learner over the decades. So in the 2019 edition, you'll see a really interesting article on the origins of the Adult Learner Journal and the history of the people and the work and the submissions that have gone in to produce the journal as it exists today. So there's a nice little quote here from Ted Fleming in a 2003 editorial about the first edition in 1985. And it really came into play at a time of great change. So that's not really new to us in adult and community education, or new to us in further education and training. We often find ourselves in periods of flux and change, and all those words like churn and otherwise, and changing discourse as well around the language that's used, even moving into this further education and training phrase that captures everything that we're doing or tries to. And some of us like that phrase and some of us don't. So Ted Fleming talking there is talking about the developments taking place too fast in adult education to allow time for reflection and debate. And really, the Adult Learner Journal came into play there to cast a critical analytical eye on the concept, practice, and the taken for granted assumptions of advocates of community education. So really, it's giving a chance here for people who are working, who are advising, guiding, advocating, doing all kinds of work within adult and community education, to have that voice recognised, acknowledged, and amplified out through the Adult Learner Journal. So Rob Marks, the time 2017 as well, who was a previous editor, was talking about the availability of the journal as open access, available on the website to everybody as a major strength. And it's about developing those knowledge, skills and competences in Ireland and internationally. And again, recognising and validating and really promoting the work that's going on here in Ireland. And we know that much of our work is very much recognised and celebrated across Europe. As part of all of our work in the sector and also AONTAS bringing that work through the journal and other initiatives, European Agenda for Adult Learning and other projects to a wider audience. So again, it's a conduit for us to kind of speak to others and to share our practice. So some of the past themes and topics over the last number of years, it's really been on about empowering learning through diverse communities and diverse learners. And there's some themes there that you can see on community development, policy and politics, which impact on us all, second chance education, and increasingly literacy, basic education, our language, issues around ESOL, around our changing demographics, and the way Ireland is evolving over the new millennium as such, and also reflection about that. So they're talking there about the practice and policy in adult and community education shifting. So this journal has been a recording device. Really, it's almost like time travel, moving through the different issues to see what's happening and how people within the adult and community education settings themselves are interrogating that and critically reflecting on that and producing commentary and thoughts and suggestions. And I suppose activities for change, calls for action within the journal. And that's a very important part of the work that we do to support that, to encourage that, and then to publish that so others can see it. So again, there's some work there on low literacy, on women, on unemployed, on migrants or refugees, and other diverse target groups there, including members of the travelling community, older or retired, young people, or isolated people in rural areas. So back then, when this review was carried out a number of years ago, pre-COVID, the topic of Irish language and Irish, I suppose, identity, as well as disabilities, our adult learning and well-being were not well covered over the years, but we're seeing an emergence of those topics coming through. Certainly since we've signed up to the UNCRPD on disability, and also there's some attention being focused on learner support and on supports for people with disabilities across adult education. Those topics are starting to arise in the wider research literature and in policies. And it would be wonderful to see them coming through as well from your experience, pre-policy, pre-guidelines, pre-discussion, when you're working with people in your settings on a daily basis. So here, just showing you some of the themes from the last number of years. So 2019 was really kind of a retrospective, a chance for AONTAS themselves to reflect on the journal and what it had achieved, and also celebrating 50 years as the voice of adult learning across adult and community education as an organisation. And then in 2020, that wonderful year of change, we looked at kind of the influence and the impact of Paulo Freire and his critical pedagogies and ideas of dialogue and equality across adult and community ed. And you can see that in the journal articles, how embedded and how important that view is for many people. Inclusive education as well, equality and respect. So through 2021, we of course had to acknowledge the impact of COVID-19 on our settings and on our people working and also attending, and the learner voice within that. And then through 2022, measuring that success, what's happening out in adult community and further education, and how do we acknowledge that, measure it, promote it, celebrate it. And through to 2023, a wider call for topics relating to the fields of adult and community education. And then just last year in our recent launch of the Adult Learning Journal 2024, the power of adult learning to drive change. And very much in the air, in the kind of, I won't use that terrible word, or will I, zeitgeist around us with the elections, not only in Ireland, but right across Europe and in other countries, as we know. So that real emphasis on that power and that ability to do so. So we come now to the call for this year coming, which 2025. And again, just in case you don't know about the journal, it is published once a year, usually later in the year around November. And that gives a chance in the organisation to work to work with people submitting articles and to work to make sure that those published articles are where you want them to be and also meet that call and the criteria of the journal. And I'll be explaining how that works in a minute. So for 2025, and I think very, very timely and relevant, the theme is challenging racism and creating a more inclusive society. And you'll see this call up on the website on AONTAS. But it's looking at different aspects of that, the role of adult learning in addressing racism, being an anti-racism advocate, creating and enabling culturally diverse learning experiences. And we know how culturally diverse further education, adult and communication is, education is and always has been. And we see that through the demographics of our learners and increasingly more our practitioners and people working in adult and community education as well. We want to learn and talk about practices that support positive transformations for a more just and equal society, and something that we need a lot of now and would be wonderful to see and to amplify through the journal. Because often when we talk to each other and we meet people at conferences and at presentations and webinars, we hear about these practices and what people are doing on the ground with learners, with colleagues, with peers together, creating very effective, very transformative change within their own settings. And sometimes we don't get to see those or to hear about those. And this is one way of getting that information out there, of getting that knowledge out there, and the impact that it's had on learners and practitioners and people right across adult and community ed. Another part of the call is the impact of government policies on widening access and participation in underrepresented ethnic groups. And we see that again, often in community and adult education and in unaccredited courses, as well as QQI programs in ESOL, in additional supports that are happening at a community level. And again, a little bit invisible to the wider national field. And to be able to demonstrate those and explain and describe those to others is part of what we're doing with the journal. The last two there is around the role of language in adult learning, and that's kind of challenging the discourse. So the culture wars out there, the amplified voices through social media, and the misinformation and the disinformation that occurs across the board. And we heard a lot of it coming up to the election as well. So just to challenge that and call to action about recognizing what it is and pushing back against it is crucial. So we talked there about case studies. So we're looking for case studies, what you've done, what you've observed, what you see has created a positive change in this space in which adult learning can contribute to greater cultural competence, cultural diversity, social inclusion, or empowerment of oppressed groups. And these are things that are happening all the time. We're very conscious of that, and you can see it through the work AONTAS does with adult and community education settings. And we're looking to see that reflected in the journal as well. So just in a very simple way, if you haven't written or if you haven't published before and you're feeling a little bit cautious about it, it's really that story, that narrative, that message, that experience, that program. We'd love to hear what you have found out through it and what you want to say about that. So it could be anything that you've implemented in your job or your role or your practice. It doesn't matter how small the change is. We all know that the body of knowledge is made up of hundreds of millions of thousands of tiny little pieces of change. And what's different about it is that they're documented and that they're recorded so that others can see them too. So if it's a very small thing that's happened, don't, disregard it. Look at it and interrogate it, reflect on it and write it up. It'll be very, very important and very interesting and useful for others to see what you have done in your practice. Maybe you want to raise awareness about something. You've seen a gap, you've seen an issue, and it's not been addressed either in strategies or policies in your own setting or in the regional or national space. Maybe there's something you can do about that. So to write that up and also to share it with others would be very valuable. And maybe you've done something differently that challenges usual thinking. So there's a lot going on across further education in terms of integrated learning, inclusive practice. And those two words, learner support, which just covers such a huge array of interactions, of relationships, of thoughtful, supportive, responsive practice from people everywhere across adult and community education. That needs to be really looked at and I think represented and documented for others to see. Because again, it can be invisible, and that recognition and acknowledgement is not happening. So all of that is happening under learners' support and has been happening for decades is really important to document, in my view. And then maybe you want to comment on something. Maybe you just want to, you don't want to document or write up or enter a piece of research, but you might want to comment on a policy direction or a strategy or a guideline or a new approach that has come out. Or maybe you have experience of how that's working in practice and you want to share that. That's something that we also very much welcome. And we'll show you how to do that in the next minute or so. Okay. Before we get into the meat of it, is there any questions from anybody on what we've covered so far? No? Okay. I'll keep charging on ahead. All right. So in terms of submissions for the Adult Learner Journal, there are three types of submissions. So the first two types, type one and type two, are the articles. And again, if you're familiar with publishing or you're reading your journal articles through Google Scholar, open access journals, or if you have access to any university repositories, you'll see those types of theory-led, research-led, maybe literature-led articles there. And they can be quite intimidating because they can be very dense in terms of language and jargon that is specific to a particular sector. And you'll find that sometimes it can take a while to actually get into what they're saying. And that can be because obviously they're written by specialists for specialists. So sometimes in terms of the journals, it depends on the audience that you're writing for, and that will guide the type of writing that you're going to produce. And the same thing applies here for the Adult Learner Journal. The audience for the Adult Learner Journal is wide. It's international, it's national, and it's also quite local. So the language in part is not as dense as these specialized journals can be, but it does need a rigor. It needs an academic quality to it in terms of one of the types of papers in particular, and in the second type of paper, less so. So just to explain, in type one, we're focusing on those theory or critical debate type papers, and they tend to be very academic in structure, in writing, and in presentation, because we're looking for those papers to engage and reflect on critical debate and analysis of concepts, policies, and theories in the field. So they may be capturing research that's been carried out. It can be in a master's or a doctorate role, or it can also be evaluations or research that you've carried out in your setting or taking part in your setting. So usually it would include a brief outline of research methodologies. It would include verbatims, as in quotes from people, participants who've taken part in a research or in an initiative or program. And it tries to structure that in a kind of formalized way. And we'll give you an example of that structure in a second. And that's really because people are, when they're used to reading journal articles, there is a structure, a systematic process that takes place through those. And it's to follow that structure so it's clear, there's no duplication, and people can understand what you did, why you did it, how you did it, and what the impact of that was. So really, it's just a slightly more formalized way of presenting that. In the type two articles, what we're looking for is practice-based papers. And you'll see that the word count has changed there. So the theory-based papers are 8,000 words, and that doesn't include references. And you might go, oh my God, that's an incredible amount of words. But actually, because we're looking for you to systematically describe what you're doing, and to give those explanations and definitions about your work, you run out of words fairly quickly. I know you don't believe me, but it's true. So you may well use all of those 8,000 words and be looking for more. In the practice-based papers, we're looking for 3,000 words as a word count. And that's the maximum. So aiming towards that like the debate of the speed limit. It's the maximum 3,000 words. So you can work up to that in that paper. And that is case studies. So we want to hear about what you're doing, how you did it, who was taking part in it, and what the impact of it was. And those examples of good practice can be, as I said, about a very small thing or about an initiative or a program or something that you have created a change in your work practice or setting. So we'd love to see those. Um, Nearly all of them will be innovative because it's you doing it with a particular set of learners within a particular setting. So all of it is new, is original, and it is wonderful to be able to read that as your peer, as a practitioner, as a learner, and see how that was done and the impact that it had. The type three of the submissions that you can make to the journal are book reviews or policy reviews. And these are smaller, they're 750 words and they're tight to keep that critical kind of review tight. But it's where you have a chance to express your commentary, your observations, your viewpoint of a book, of a policy, of a set of guidelines or strategies from your particular perspective. So that might be a very interesting kind of entry into writing and into publishing to actually express your opinion in that way in a smaller word count without as much criteria upon it in terms of writing. So here, just nice, bit like learning outcomes, isn't it? Just some verbs around how you might write your. All right, I'll just mark that off. Sorry, guys, getting enthusiastic there about learning outcomes. Um, there's some verbs here around how you might write your paper articles. So again, you want to align your topic for a type one or two with the journal focus. And we often get asked questions about that. Does it have to be very strictly adhering to the focus? And to one extent, yes, it would be good to have it in terms of anti-racism, looking at that cultural diversity and kind of a call for action around that. But equally so, there are other articles that will occur in this year that are relevant, align, or maybe tangential to that. We would still encourage you to submit those. We would like to see them, and consider them as well as part of that call. So please don't be deterred by what you might think of as a kind of restricted theme. You can also submit other articles there. And if there's a chance that maybe it's not aligning, we will come back to you and perhaps that could be put for another journal submission or for another article in the Adult Learner in a following year. So to align with the journal focus, to write to the journal audience, which is wide, members of the public, experts, practitioners, learners, academics, right across the field. State your philosophy and your bias. I'll talk about that in a little minute, but it's just really so we know who you are in the work, in the writing that you submit, who you are, what you're doing, why you're doing it, and your kind of viewpoints and philosophies there. And that may be that commitment to Freirean principles or to inclusive education or to equality and respect, but just to let us know. And to structure your article, again, we have some suggestions around that, and also to discuss any limitations that may have happened for you in creating a program or carrying out a practice or doing some research or evaluations, and also the significance of that, the importance of it, to justify what you're doing and to explain why what you did is important and how it can help others in the most clear way. As in, that's what significance is about, improving the body of knowledge and helping others. And then also to write in a consistent style. And AONTAS has developed a style guide to help you with that up on the website. I'll reference it now in a minute. And that style guide is comprehensive. Again, not to deter you, but just to show you how that consistency can be achieved in terms of the grammar, the punctuation, the presentation, and how it's structured. And it's an incredibly useful tool to have with you as you're writing. And then to provide evidence. So again, the evidence needs to come from two sources in writing generally. So your evidence comes from the literature, journal articles, guidelines, statistics, demographics, legislation, all those different sources of knowledge that you can use to underpin what you're doing, why you did it. and also then the data that you collect from participants. So those transcripts of interviews, the answers to questionnaires, how you did that, how you designed your research or your evaluation or your interaction with somebody, what you collected, what came out of it when you analysed it and you looked for the meaning of that and what that means. So again, these are kind of terms that we use to mean very simple concepts and very simple processes, which I hope will become clear. So a suggested structure here, going back there, in terms of how you might do that work. Sorry, I was getting rid of I have all the faces in front of me here. Your title, your abstract, keywords that we can use in the journal for searching purposes to help you find what you're looking for, an introduction that sets the scene for this article that you've written, and maybe some research questions within that, a literature section that might be entwined with the introduction, which is again setting that context, giving us some evidence of what you already know and what's already known in the literature about that topic. And then the methodology, which is the how of the work. How did you carry out research? How did you explore this practice? Was it a reflection? Was it an evaluation? Did you interview people? Did you ask some questions? What was it? And then what you found out from that in terms of findings and your discussion. And often that might come out in the shape of themes, three or four themes that really broadly encapsulate what you found out and the meaning of what you found out. And then at the end of the article, a conclusion that sits with the introduction, what you were looking to do and what you did and what you found out, and perhaps some recommendations around next steps for that. We always look for a reference list, and the reference list being every piece of literature that you've referenced in the article. And again, in the style guide, there's instructions on how you can do that using the Leeds referencing style. How's everyone doing? Are people still with me? Can't we? I'm looking at you, Juliana. Yes? Okay, we'll keep going. So just some examples here from past successful submissions to the journals. This is back from 2022. But I think these two are two nice headings here, nice examples. So this is a theory-based type 1 article, okay? And it's on psychological capital, the missing link by Aisling Brennan and Maeve O'Grady. And as we move through this just next few slides, you might recognize names of people who've submitted to the article in the last, to the journal in the last couple of years. And you'll see that they're colleagues and peers and people you know in adult and community education. But this is a very interesting article because it's very accessible and easy to read, even though it can be quite a scientific and focused area around psychological capital and psychology as a science in particular. And what they were looking at was the potential of PsyCap as a means of widening outcomes and measures in PhET in terms of managing the success for adult learners. So it was really interesting how they did it and how they wrote it. So they had an introduction explaining what the article aims to do, where the source evidence comes from. And that, as it turned out, was in a doctoral research, and the gaps in practice. So they're kind of explaining where they saw the gap for the psychological capital approach. And then they talked about the context of the area that they're working in. So a broad presentation of that context using literature from policy, from the European Union, from NGOs, from charities, from journal articles, all of those stakeholders and decision makers in the settings that we work in that influence what we do. So they were using evidence from that. And then they did a specific piece about psychological capital because not everybody would be aware of it. And they explained what it was and how it linked to adult education, very simply, straightforwardly, while still not losing, the clarity of the approach. And then they discussed findings. So the findings were from literature and doctoral research kind of woven together in a way that made it clear that what they were finding out either agreed with or disagreed with what was already known. And that kind of shows the significance of what they were doing. So their recommendations were there then after that in a very logical way. And then the conclusion around what they found out, what had been written, limitations around that, what they would have done if they'd had more time or what they might do more in the future, and the author's viewpoint around the success and the impact of it. So they kind of work through this in very simple language in parts, and that's what we'd love to see as well. You can use we, you can use I to speak to your view, your viewpoint. It doesn't have to be in that kind of academic passive voice all the time, but it's more around the consistency and clarity and the logic of the writing, that people can follow it with you. And I often think it's like taking somebody's hand and bringing them with you on a journey. So it has a natural sequence, beginning, a development, and an end. Often the way we talk to our students and learners about how to write an essay. So it moves to this systematic procedure and it brings people with you. In terms of the practice based, again, if you remember, it's a 3,000 word article. So actually less than half of the theory based piece. And it's really about, again, bringing people on a journey and explaining what you did in very clear and simple and straightforward way, in the way that you would speak about it to colleagues, while still having some structure in that. So that kind of rigor, that consistency and validity is still there for others to see. So this is from our friends in AONTAS, Thomas Murray, and talking about community education for human rights and social inclusion. And it was a program that they developed, partnering with international protection applicants living in direct provision. So an area that often you don't get an insight into unless you're involved with direct provision. So again, making something visible that is little known. And again, there's a structure there of an introduction, a description of Uncle and the program, what they're doing. So that's part of, in terms of writing, don't assume that others know what you're doing, and don't assume that what you're about to say is too small or insignificant to mention. It is always good to write out clearly what's actually happening and the definitions of what you're talking about, and to assume that literally an alien from Mars is coming in and knows nothing about adult education and knows nothing about your program. So don't assume that you're bigger minds than yours or mine. And I always assume this when I'm writing, that other people know so much more, as they do, but they still need to understand you and your context. So simply explaining and defining is very much part of the writing for the journal. So introduction, description of Uncasan and the program. They've put in some data in a table form or in a visual, which we call figures, around the context setting. And they also have direct quotes from participants so that we can hear the voice, we can read the voice of international protection applicants in the work and hear what they're saying. Then program delivery, describing how it was delivered and how it worked, and then celebrating success and talking about the impact of it through an awards ceremony that was carried out with informal feedback within that from the people involved. And at the end, then they have a reflection where they're talking about the meaning of what they're doing, what it means to Uncle Sam, what it means to the applicants themselves, what it means generally in terms of a program like this, and how it can help others. So that worked really well. They had headings through it that was posting where they were going. There wasn't as much literature, but there was inclusion of relevant policies and reports that helped us to make sense of where they were positioning this work, and was really useful for others who are interested in this area and want to read more. The quotes very, very just very reflective of the lived experience of people and their views and their opinions and their feelings. So the verbatims can be very emotional, can be very effective, and they place the reader in the research and place the reader in the program. So we would recommend the use of verbatim quotes throughout. And although it was mainly descriptive and fact-based, that emotion came through because of that combination. So just briefly, because I have, as I mentioned, have lost track of time. 2024, just to finish up for getting there. This was the Adult Learner Journal. There's about 4 articles, theory-based, 8,000 words long. And then we had this number of practice-based case studies within it, which was wonderful to see. And you might recognize again names there and topic areas that you're interested in around inclusion, around LGBTQ, around disabilities, numeracy, digital tools, learning platforms, early school leavers and leadership development, as well as learners leaving adult learning services. So very wide area, and yet not, because it's about people. It's about the people working in adult and community ed. It's about the people coming in and working with us in adult and community ed. So that theme and that structure is inherent. It's going through as a thread through all the articles within the journal. And then we had our book and policy reviews. We were looking at a book from Maynooth on critical perspectives in FET, a very large Routledge International Handbook of Equality and Inclusion that you can see I reviewed. It was very large. And then the policy review on global citizens strategy that came out last year. And maybe people weren't aware of it being there, but just to have it highlighted to you where it might affect you in terms of adult and community education, I think is valuable and very useful. And lastly, there, a review of learner support in further education training, a framework. So again, someone who knows what they're talking about in adult and community ed, who can see it from different perspectives or from the inside, expressing an opinion and a viewpoint on these particular dimensions. So I've just put in briefly here, I'm conscious I've been talking for ages, on academic rigor and trustworthiness. And again, not to be all academic and intimidating, but what's interesting about this is that the Adult Learner Journal is primarily qualitative, though we do welcome, quantitative studies as well that have statistics and a kind of a more scientific viewpoint. But in terms of qualitative research, where you're working with people, some people from the quantitative realm would kind of go, well, how do you know? This is just people talking to you. How do you know how that is trustworthy? How can you know that it's valid or it's reliable? And Lincoln and Guba, back from the 89s, the last century, last millennium, talk about these different aspects. So they talk about credibility, transferability, dependability, confirmability, so all the abilities. And really, what it is very straightforward, simple, people to people explanations of work and what they're doing. So sometimes when you're working with research in those theoretical frames, and often also in programs, and it's not even as sometimes, you have to think of ethics, you have to think of doing good, and you have to think of your learners and your participants, as well as yourself as a researcher in the process. So some people will have gone through ethics review processes in universities or other educational settings, and others will have used ethical processes within your own settings. But if you do that, and I would recommend that you do, speak to that in the article as well. In terms of transferability, it's about people being able to judge themselves whether this piece of work is reliable, valid, and relevant to where they are. So often with these small pieces of research, you can't generalize. If I say, three of us in AONTAS like sherbet lollipops, I can't assume everybody across Dublin likes them as well. So the very, very silly analogy there. But in terms of thick description, we mean quotes from participants. So those verbatims that underpin the points you're making within your article. And then dependability. And that's that stating the obvious bit, step by step. Don't assume anybody knows what you're talking about or assume that people will anticipate what you're going to say. Just put it all down in the paper, because on the paper or on the screen is what people are going to see, and it needs to be all there for them to understand. And then the last bit there is confirmability. And this is where you come in, who you are, what you do, what are your values, what are your beliefs, to put those in there as well into the article so people get to know you, understand you, and see where you're coming from in your writing. Really helpful, really valuable. So here are the nuts and bolts, how you submit an article. This again is up on the website and we'll embed the links in here. But you write the full article, all right? So the 8,000 word, the 3,000 word, or the 750 word, and you submit it to the journal@aontas.com address with your title, the title type. There's an author submission statement, which is a short one, and there's an example of it in the guide, and a signed copyright statement. Unfortunately, these are the things we have to look at in this day and age around copyright, intellectual property, legislation, and a short profile of yourself, a little bio of yourself, so we can include that as well in the journal. And you must submit an article abstract. Okay, so here's an example of an article abstract from the example we looked at from Uncasan. That's about 150 words, so somewhere between kind of 100 and 150 words there. and that's how it's presented. So I'm just putting it there, for example, in that the title of the article is 16 point Times New Roman, and then the rest is in 12 point. And again, we're using the style guide in terms of punctuation, font, size of text, and how it works through to keep that consistency and kind of rigor in the presentation of the work. So the creative people in AONTAS have done a number of infographics that are up on the website as well to help you. So I've just reproduced two of them here for you. The peer review process, where after you've submitted your article on the 14th of February, it's considered by the editorial board, including myself, Rosemary, David, and others, and it is peer reviewed. But before that happens, it is anonymised. So none of us know who has submitted the article. And at least two people will review your work and look at it under a number of criteria, including some of the ones we've been talking about there, and give general feedback. And they'll also provide you with an article which has track changes on it, so you can see specific in text kind of notations or suggestions for you in terms of making the article perhaps read more systematically, more coherently, or just things that you might have missed when you can't see the wood for the trees in the middle of the writing process. And as you know, all journal articles do peer review generally, and it's a really, really useful part of writing to get that other pair of eyes on your work and to hear back what worked and what's not working and how to make it better. So then you return it with specific, when you have done it, sorry, and incorporated the feedback, you send it back to AONTAS and there's decisions made about it. And depending on the outcome, you will, you submit it, they look at it, you're asked to to make changes on the feedback, and then depending on the outcome of whether it's been accepted, they'll be back in touch with you again, possibly with additional feedback about the work. So there are track changes, there are revisions, there's a lot of support there for you in the writing. And specifically for those of you who haven't written before, we're here to help you with that and to make sure that your message and what you want to communicate is represented in the article. And then in the final stages, the editorial board review the changes that have been made and submissions, and then it goes on for publication, which will include copy editing and proofreading. So the peer review timeline there goes from February through to March to April to May, where you have 2nd of May articles returned by authors with completed revisions. And then from the 5th of May through the summer, there was work around proofreading, copy editing, and compiling the articles. In August, the copy editing process is finalised and continues to finish for the completion and publication of the actual journal in November 2025. So if you need more supports, there's lots there. There's a workshop in the 13th of January where we'll go into things in more depth. And there's an editorial office editorial as well that can provide feedback on technical aspects of your article. And there's one thing we want to talk to you about, which is the peer learning network. So I am just going to turn this off. And see if there are any questions. Okay. People are generally awake. Thank you for bearing with me on that, guys. I can see there's a chat there and there are potentially some questions there. Is there anyone who'd like to ask a question now? Klaus.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jane, for giving us the opportunity to learn more about the journal, because it's helpful to conceptualize an article we are probably going to submit. I've got just a simple technical question. You highlighted, or you mentioned, that the articles will be anonymized by the editors, which this means that we just submit an article with all our names, all our information, and it will be cut off by your team. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Or should we submit an article as well with the where we deleted our hints on our persons?
No, I would suggest that you submit the article with your identifiers within it and what your name and your articles and your authors, and then the team themselves will address that anonymization issue. I wonder, Juliana or any of the editorial
Yes,
board want to jump in?
I'm here. Hello.
Yeah.
So your identifying information and all the contact details are going to go in the author submission statement. And the article, when you're submitting it to us, if you can leave out your name on the top, that would be helpful. And then the editorial office will go through and redact any identifying information, which might be previous publications, your place of work, things like that. So by the time it gets to our wonderful editorial board, they have no idea who wrote it. And then by the time that if it's accepted, we'll put all the information back in and make sure that you're happy with it.
Fantastic. That's helpful. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you, Klaus. Any other questions while we're here? Perhaps I might ask you, oh, it does not get somebody be except for that. Yeah, I think we use the Leeds referencing style just in answer there to Andrew. So it's very well documented in the style guide. It's not hugely different to APA in terms of referencing. So I think you should be fine to kind of adjust your references to that, hopefully. But any questions on that, do let us know. Martina.
Yes, thank you for this very interesting presentation. I'd just like to ask you the different types of papers when it comes to how many, the distribution of them. You were saying that last issue was 4 and 8, 4 with type 1 and then 8 others. So is that the normal, or how can that, does it differ from different issues, or how does that work?
Well, I'll say briefly from my experience, Martina, and thanks for the question, that it differs. Yeah, very much so that we are open to the submissions that come through. And then as we review them and work through them in terms of the journal, that can move from year to year. And you'll see from the number of the adult learner journals that are up on the website, open to you on the PDFs, that changes. And Juliana, you might want to talk to this, but also we sometimes separate them. In
Yes.
previous years, we haven't. So, Juliana, do you want to take that up?
Yeah, and again, it varies on the amount of articles that we publish in a year. So in our last edition, we had a lot of submissions and we separated them into 3 different sections, but in different years, it differs. It just depends on the articles that we get in.
Does that answer your question, Martina?
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I don't know if people would like to put in the chat the kind of areas they're thinking of submitting on, or whether it's a theory or a practice article.
Jane, I think there was another question in the chat there about does the edition have a general theme?
Oh yes, yeah. The theme is on anti-racism, right? So it's exploring that kind of. Actually, sorry, Kate, will you tell the theme because it's on the slide and I'm having a mental block.
Yeah, well, we at AONTAS are really interested, and we actually have a project coming up this year on anti-racism, and obviously in relation to the link between that and the rise of disinformation online, and changing demographics in Ireland. So it's generally around racism and anti-racism, linking with, I suppose, kind of community and the idea of collective, migration, integration, and bringing people together, particularly how adult and community education tends to break down barriers, bring people together, and encourage a shared sense of belonging, regardless of where people are coming from. So yeah, we very much welcome your thoughts.
Thanks, Kate. So the presentation can be circulated and will be in the recording, and there will be embedded links in it to the style guide and to the call, which has a number of different criteria underneath it as well. Not criteria, but areas that you could explore within that particular theme. And as we said earlier, if there's another aspect to it or something that aligns or is tangential, please still do submit so that we can look at your work and see if that can be included as well in the journal. So it's a very open, respectful process from the members of the team and AONTAS and the editorial board to look at the submissions and all the submissions that come through and ensure that we give them a rigorous and also thoughtful and responsive review to the work that's going on out in adult and community education. Any other questions from anyone there? Or if you'd like to share the area you're thinking of into the chat, be great to see, or perhaps unmute and let us know.
Also, Jane, I think there is another question in the chat.
Oh, great.
Just asking about his content analysis through a theoretical lens be considered under section 1?
Yes. Yes, I would consider so. Yeah, I mean, a particular analytical approach to the data and the way that you're doing it. Yeah, I think that sounds very interesting. And just to make sure, obviously, as you know, to explain what that theoretical lens is and give us some literature and underpinning references for that so we can understand who you are, where you're coming from, the approach, and what you're trying to do with the outcomes and impact of that analysis. Thank you. And also great, thanks to have a conference information there from the Sociological Association of Ireland on May 8th and 9th in UCC. That's good to know. Thank you so much. And very much the issues that we talk about, discussed and come through the journal, I'm sure will be discussed there. Thank you for sharing that. Appreciate that. And then there's an article there on church language cafes as community learning spaces for migrants. Really interesting. Yes, I think very relevant to the topic and the theme of the 2025 journal. Certainly so. There's many kind of different spaces like Fulcha, Stock and other areas and programs that are working, but I think that would be very useful for the theme. Thank you. And the ongoing reforms of FET. Yeah, Sean, thank you for that. The ongoing reforms of FET is changing the role, practice and identities of teachers. I don't know if you'd like to speak to that a little bit or not, but certainly that's something we're seeing coming through in research at the moment, and from people on the ground are talking about that and the impact of it. So yes, I think that would absolutely be relevant. Another interesting question there about how do we obtain ethical certification? It depends where you're working. Okay, sorry, I just can't see your name properly there. Do you mind pronouncing it for me? I must apologize.
My name is Adekbeju, just as it
Adequate.
spells. Yes, thank you.
Absolutely. It's not your the spelling, it's my glasses. So I apologize. The ethical certification, if you're doing a master's or a doctoral thesis or you're affiliated to some university, there's ethical reviews through that. In the ETB settings and in community and adult education, you wouldn't necessarily have access to those kind of processes. But certainly there might well be kind of protocols or procedures there about doing research, not necessarily so now, but it's coming through with it, with this interest in research that's happening across the ETB network at the moment. There may be protocols and processes about how to work with learners and kind of parameters around that. So it might be worthwhile just asking the question, is there any kind of instructions or guidelines around that? Certainly with ethical procedures, what we're kind of talking about is plain language statements so that people know what they're getting into, and informed consent, where people know what the project is about and why they're being asked for information and their viewpoints and what that will be used for. So there's kind of like little baselines there around it. What we could do is look at developing a kind of resource around that, or if you'd like to even send us an email around what you're trying to do, or if you can't find any advice on it, because it's really around the principles of voluntary participation, informed consent, confidentiality, and then it's really GDPR this protection of data piece that comes in around how that data is used and whether they can get access to it or have it back or withdraw at any stage. So it's about stating all of those rights to participants when they're taking part in research. But do you think it might be useful for people to have a resource around that? A kind of an ethical viewpoint or approach? And we could look into that. Yeah. Okay. All right. So would people like to go into break rooms just for 5 or 10 minutes, or even just 5 minutes to talk about their article with others, and then just come back for a sum up and any questions that may come from that? Are people happy to do that? Yeah. Okay, we'll just do it for a few minutes so, and then we can finish up soon. Let you have your lunch. Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks, Juliana. I don't, if anyone from any of the groups want to comment on what happened in the discussion or want to ask a question.
Could we just finish a discussion because we were halfway through a sentence when we were
Of course.
transported back to the main room. Adi was talking. Do you want to come on, Adepeju, and finish where we were? Adi was talking about the possibility of an article about the experience of migrant students within a number of different ETBs. Are you there? Ade?
Yeah, so I'm looking at these thematics, culture shock. Excuse me. I'm looking at these thematics, skill recognition or lack of recognition, race, cultural integration or disintegration, culture shock, and language. And I'm looking at using both qualitative and quantitative methodology. And then, apart from the students, we also want to look at the school heads and the teachers, because we want to look at the school culture. You know, how welcoming is the school? How prepared are they to integrate the students who are coming in? Because the experience I had is the first ETB I attended, I was overqualified for the course I went to do. So I was asked to withdraw. So I withdrew from the school. And then the second one, oh my God, the school was racist from up to down. You know, I had to leave. And many students were crying because of language difficulties. And there was no understanding at all, you know, compared to the first school I went, you understand? So yeah. I want to look at what students are going through and how we can help you, how the results can help policymakers within the school structure. Thank you.
Eddie, can I say a couple of things on that? Again, in terms of content, subject and focus, that's really right within the call, isn't it? That's exactly what we want to hear about. In terms of an article, I think you've got to think really carefully about the breadth of what you want to do, because that's a lot to try and cover all of those things. You know, and it's just an article. It can't cover all of those things. So you might need to focus down on something. Case study might be a really interesting way of doing it. You know, if you were to find a couple of students and what was their journey and what was their experience, perhaps, or an institution, you know, you talk to some students, some teachers, some administrators in that institution. But yeah, it's working out how you can do something with enough depth that you're able to say something useful and interesting for people to read without trying to, you know, cover every single thing in you know, even 8,000 words, which is quite a lot, is not a lot when you start writing stuff. But yeah, I mean, in terms of structuring it, just think about, you know, how could you tell that story succinctly, I suppose, is the best way of saying it, without trying to bring in too many things. I don't know if Jane or others want to come in on that, so as a general point.
Yeah, to think of your time frame, and just to kind of cut your cloth, as we say, in that I think there's an awful lot that could be said there, and even what you've alluded to so far is incredibly valuable and relevant to the call, and we'd love to see that submitted through. but just 14th of February will come up quite quickly. So just maybe to focus in on one or two or three areas that you wish to explore, and do those in a little bit of depth, comparing it to what's already known and what is emerging and maybe is a gap in what's happening out there. So I think it'll be really interesting. And maybe come to the workshop in January as well, so we can talk with you about how you're getting on with that, how it's coming together for you, and give you some support if you'd like it.
Okay, could I just add in as well, it's also just that, this journal is the adult learning journal, so it is about primarily about adult learners. So, that might be something that you can also kind of just take on board in terms of your focus then around, that sort of idea of challenging racism. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Thanks, David. Thanks, guys. We had an interesting discussion as well with two very different presentations or ideas around Kevin, and please jump in, Kevin, as an information officer, looking at how people are accessing adult education primarily online, in many cases being diverted to fetchcourses.ie and working through that, and the implications of that, the obstacles or the hindrances that can be there, and really the underpinning kind of context of why that's happening, how it's happening, and the impact of what it's doing. So to look at that, and I suppose it's kind of intersectional in a way because it's members of the public coming through. So we'll just see how that works out and how that emerges from people coming from across kind of all context settings, home environments, ethnicities, age, gender, and otherwise, and see how that would work. I think it'd be really interesting. And Andrew then as well, coming from a perspective around adult education in Uganda, taking a documentary lens to kind of perspective on adult learning programs, maybe three in particular, Andrew, you said, I think, that have emerged after the one policy document that exists on adult ed that was produced in 1992. And we were just discussing how that has some links to our own experience with the 2000 white paper on adult education that we're still waiting to finish. So thank you for that, Kevin and Andrew. I don't know if you want to add anything or if you're happy with what we've talked about so far.
Yeah, so far good. Yeah, thank you.
Great,
Yeah.
thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Kevin. Does anyone else have any other questions before we wrap up? Or can we help you in any way? We do have the next writers workshop on the 13th of January. And also we were suggesting potentially if people would be interested in a peer network, a peer support network, where if you were interested in that we would have your emails, and that we'd facilitate you being in touch with each other. And then also, I'm happy to answer any questions that might emerge from that discussion or that support that you're giving each other, if you would like advice or some additional help on that. Would people be interested in that generally, do you think? Okay, all right. Okay, well, we'll look into that, and maybe with your permission, we'll contact you on it. And obviously, it's voluntary. Okay, so only if it makes sense that it could be a support for you. Thanks, Kathy. Okay, Kate, Juliana, David, Rosemary, have we covered everything we need to? Okay, well,
Yeah.
I think it just remains for me then to thank everybody. Thank you, Andrew. Thanks everybody for coming today and for taking part. We're looking forward to seeing your submissions. We're very excited about it, and we're here to help where we can.
Thank you very much. Has her hand up there.
Oh, sorry, Martina.
Yes, sorry, a little late. I'm just curious to know the next workshop. How is it? What's the idea of that? What will we do?
It's really to progress. So be more focused on the writing itself, on your research article, on the topic, and how it's coming together for you, how we can support you around that in terms of structure and approach and consistency, but also any questions you might have just around the actual capturing, recording and presenting. if that would be of use to you. That's what we'll do. So we'll give it a good bit of time. Less of me gabbing on in a PowerPoint, more of us discussing and working together.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.